Alright, so what you see here is a standard linguistic argument in English language that we're going to translate into a categorical form. Here's the argument. Joe probably will have heart problems in the future because he has creased earlobes and a depressed sternum. It is these characteristics which have been associated with heart attacks. Alright, so this is something that you will encounter in your everyday life. Just somebody in casual conversation makes this argument. What we're going to do is we're going to deconstruct this into what logicians call a standard categorical form. It's going to look a little awkward at first, but it makes it a whole lot easier for us to actually deconstruct. So the very first thing we're going to do in this argument is we're going to look for the conclusion. So if you dig through the language here, what you're going to try and figure out is, what is this argument really about? If you look at the argument, we've got the subject Joe. All right, this is what the argument is about. And what's going to happen in the future is he'll probably have heart problems. So if we look through the language of the argument here, I'm going to highlight for you. Alright, Joe probably will have heart problems in the future. This is the conclusion of the argument. So I'm going to label that here for you. And this is actually what you should do for yourself when you're going through these exercises. Alright, so there's the conclusion of the argument. Then what you're going to do is you're going to locate what are called the premises of the argument. And so what we got is a bunch of information, right, that tells us a little bit about how we reach this conclusion. Those are the premises of the argument. One of the premises that you're going to notice here is this one. He has creased earlobes and a depressed sternum. And there's something that is a piece of evidence that helps us to lead us to that conclusion. Here's another piece of information. Alright, it is these characteristics which have been associated with heart attacks. These are what we call the premises. Now these things together, right? These things together are actually what tell us, all right, about that argument. So when you actually translate this, what you're going to do is you're going to pull out all that information. You're going to put it into a standardized form. Before we do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about standardizing some of the terms. In order for us to actually make a conclusion here, we need to identify three things. We need to identify the subject of the argument, we need to identify the predicate of the argument, and we need to define what is going to be the middle term. Right? That's how we link the subject to the predicate. So the subject is very easily told, right? Very easy to find. What the argument is about is Joe. Alright, so that's the subject of our argument. Oh, actually here, I'll write it over here so you can see it. Alright, so Joe is our subject. The predicate is actually what comes out of the conclusion. Alright, so the subject is Joe, that's what the argument's about, and the concluding fact that we're going to have is Joe probably will have heart problems in the future. So what we got here, if we look, alright, having heart problems in the future is what we call the predicate. Alright, the predicate of the argument. Once we have this set of information, there's only one thing left that we need to find, and that's what we call the middle term. The middle term is what helps us to link Joe to the heart problems, or the possible heart problems. And so looking through all the information that we have here, you know, this idea about having creased earlobes and a depressed sternum is actually what leads us to that conclusion. Alright, so what you're going to do is take this information that you see here, right, having creased earlobes and a depressed sternum, and in fact, if you look in the second premise here, it's these characteristics. Right? These things together are actually what we call the middle term. Now sometimes when you actually look at an argument, you'll see that, you know, the wonderful English language allows us to state the same thing in a number of different ways. And so in this case, while we're looking at the idea of creased earlobes and a depressed sternum being the actual characteristics that seem to lead us to this idea that we might have heart problems in the future, restating this in the second sentence to make it flow a little bit better in the English language, we shorten that up to these characteristics because we already have that information in the first premise. We just simply, realize that these two things are the same. And we naturally do this as human beings. We're able to, do that sort of translation ourselves in our own heads. And so now that you've identified all this information, what you're going to do is you're going to restate this, reformulate this argument into what we call a categorical syllogism. Here's what that is going to look like. Now the conclusion, looking at our translation, is the easiest thing that we actually have to identify. Again, it's the one that says here, Joe will have heart problems in the future. Alright. And I've highlighted that in green just like we did before. Okay. Now, from the conclusion, again, what I'll get you to do is label. And don't be afraid of actually labeling these things, because that's what's going to help you in these exercises to begin with. If you don't label things, you never really learn the terms, and that's actually what you're going to be tested on in the end. Alright, so Joe is our subject, and having heart problems in the future, this is our predicate. Alright, this is what we're being told about the subject in the end from this argument. Alright, so subject and predicate. Once we've identified these things, putting together the rest of the premises is actually pretty easy. I'm going to give you one standard form. There are a number of different standard forms that we can have to state an argument. If you watch some of the posted YouTube videos that I pointed to, there's a whole discussion on the idea of mood and figure, and that's how we rearrange a lot of these terms in different ways to actually create arguments. I'm going to give you the simplest form of the argument. It's what's called the standard A form argument, where we're going to actually look at a number of universals leading to a universal conclusion. In this case, Joe is, as a subject, is a category unto himself. Alright, so we're going to consider that to be a universal quantity. All of the rest of the things we're also going to state as universal quantities as well. For instance, if we look at the major premise here, we've got all people. Joe, again, a category unto himself. Alright, so what we're going to do is take one of those pieces of information that we found in the previous, standard for a linguistic form argument, where we identified one of the premises. One of the premises was Joe having creased earlobes and a depressed sternum. Alright, so I've gone up here and I've labeled this the minor premise. The minor premise always contains the subject. Alright, so this is always the case. Alright, so the minor premise is the one that always has the subject in it. The subject in the minor premise always leads to the middle term. Alright, so again, as we found in the previous little bit on our argument in linguistic form, alright, we identified the creased earlobes and depressed sternum as our middle term. Alright, so in the minor premise, subject always leads to the middle term. Okay? So the only other thing we have left, alright, from information in that previous linguistic argument is, the fact that people with depressed sternums and creased earlobes will have heart problems. Alright, that was what we identified as a premise in the other argument here. So you're going to notice that from the conclusion, we go up to the major premise. Right, this idea of having heart problems is actually our predicate. Alright, so predicate is always identified in the major premise, subject is always what appears in the minor premise. And the middle term, alright, so again, the middle term was, people having creased earlobes and a depressed sternum. Alright, so in this case, people with creased earlobes and a depressed sternum, again, this is where our middle term appears. Alright, so middle term in this case always leads to the predicate, alright, in the major premise. So middle term to predicate, subject to middle term, and the linkage between the subject to the predicate through that middle term is what allows us to make that conclusion. So whenever you're presented with an argument to translate into what it calls categorical form, this is actually what you're doing. All right, so you always identify the conclusion first. I know it sounds a little backwards at the beginning, but it's really the easiest thing to pick out. And then from that conclusion, you can easily identify what the subject of the argument is, what the predicate of the argument is, and then from there, once you state that in a minor and major premise, then you can sort of sort out from that linguistic form argument what the linkage term is. And that's what the middle term is, and that's what you'll state in the major premise and the minor premise. Alright, so it's as easy as that. Practice it with a number of different exercises. There's plenty of them that you'll find in the Volume 3 textbook. Try a few out, post it in the discussion forum. We'll go through some of those things. Remember, the discussion forum is your classroom environment. And so just like, say, for instance, with a math classroom where you're looking at exercises on the board and that sort of thing, that's what we're doing here. All right, so practice a few of those things from your textbook. Throw up some questions on the discussion board. If you're having trouble with translation, we'll all try to work together as a group to actually sort out some of those answers. All right, give it a try. Good luck.